we're accustomed to hearing about these things happening in the United States, but we've got out of the habit in Australia since we don't have them anymore. And it was just shocking to realize that it had occurred in New Zealand and that it was an Australian who had carried out this horrific attack. And I suppose for those of us who have worked on the issue of trying to prevent gun violence, in addition to being heartbreaking, it was heart-sinking because there'd been plenty of warnings and of advice over the years that New Zealand should strengthen its gun laws, but those warnings and advice had never been heeded.
Let's go back to New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern.
I want to also acknowledge, when Australia found itself tragically in a similar position to what we find ourselves now, they took 12 days to make their decision. We have taken 72 hours. There is, though, still some detail that needs to be worked through. I want to do that, but still move as quickly as we can.
So that's the New Zealand Prime Minister. Rebecca Peters, explain what happened in Australia. I mean, a country, it's believed, of crocodile Dundees or gun lovers. How quickly this turned and what you're seeing is being demanded right now in New Zealand.
Well, in Australia, you're right. We are an outdoor country. We're a frontier country. We have a lot of people who like to use guns. And in that sense, we're similar to New Zealand. We're culturally very similar as well. But the laws had been there was a patchwork of laws across the country. Each state had different laws, and many of them were not very strong. So, for example, semi-automatic weapons were available in some states, but banned in other states. Some states had registration of all guns and some did not. And what that meant was that it was possible to take advantage of the loopholes provided by the weaker law states to commit gun violence. And in 1996, we had a mass shooting at Port Arthur in Tasmania. 35 people were killed, and at the time it was the largest tragedy of that type ever in the world. Unfortunately, it's been surpassed since then. And although there had been many attempts to reform the laws, the politicians had always been intimidated by the gun lobby and had been reluctant to do anything. But in '96, we had a brand new prime minister, and he said, I'm going to fix this. And so he called all the states together and said, we're going to once and for all fix this problem. And they came up with a scheme of a list of points that all the states agreed to put into their laws as a minimum standard. And that included a ban on semi-automatic rifles and shotguns, a buyback, as you mentioned, to get rid of them, registration of all guns in every state, much higher standard of licensing, including the need to prove that you have a legitimate reason, and a lot of other, a 28-day waiting period, and various other measures which basically close the loopholes and raise the standard and we've been much safer ever since. The first thing that obviously comes to mind when an atrocity like this happens is the question of semi-automatic weapons. And the Prime Minister of New Zealand correctly mentioned that as a priority. And in Australia, as Jacinda Ardern mentioned, it took 12 days for this agreement to be nutted out. It had to be negotiated between eight states, but that was obviously pretty quick. In New Zealand, she has announced pretty well immediately that they plan to make reforms. My slight concern is that they should take the time to consider not just piecemeal changes, like not just banning military assault weapons, but looking at all the reforms that need to be made, because the New Zealand gun law is full of loopholes.